I'm Najaswat for BizNews.com, and today we're talking about sex and porn addiction. Joining me to do this is Dr. Paula Hall, who's widely recognized as UK's leading expert in the field of sex and porn addiction, and the founder of the Laurel Centre and Pivotal Recovery. And we also have Jack Jenkins, entrepreneur, growth hacker, and founder of Remojo, which is an app that assists in the recovery from porn addiction. Thank you both for joining me.
Thank you for
Thank
having
you.
us.
Happy to be here.
Dr. Hall, you've been a psychotherapist for nearly 30 years, half of which have been spent treating patients with sex and porn addiction. Why the shift to this field?
Oh, the smartphone. So 30 years ago when I started, there was a little bit of a problem with this, but not to the level it is now. The internet has been an absolute game changer in this. It is so much more accessible than it ever was before. And as a result of that, the problem has just massively escalated because unfortunately education hasn't grown at the same rate as the internet. So yeah, because more and more people are struggling is the short answer.
And Jack, what's your background? How did you decide that this is something you wanted to address?
Yeah, so I had very much. So I'm 32, and I had very much the typical male experience these days, which is basically for anyone under the age of sort of 37, 35-ish. We're exposed to pornography through friends or by accident on the computer or smartphone or whatever at a very, very young age. So, I basically first encountered pornography when I was 11, something like that, maybe 10, through a school friend who just, dumped it on me, essentially. And then we grow up with basically having been exposed to this and having instant access 24/7, at any time, any device throughout our entire lives. And then by the time we're an adult, it becomes some kind of a habit, on or off, depending upon how our life's going. And I basically just sort of woke up one day, about 2.5, 3 years ago, and thought, wow, I wish I'd never been exposed to this. And I think my life and my relationship would definitely be better if I cut it completely from my life. And so I started on that journey, just trying to like cut it out. And I initially thought that blocking was the answer. So I started looking for blocker apps. There wasn't a good one. So I started building one because I'm quite entrepreneurial. And then as I got into the field and started talking to people and working with the users and learning much more about the problem, in various degrees, my evolution of the problem uh, expanded quite a lot. And so that's why the app has become what it is today, which is a much more well-rounded approach to behavior change. But it's been, yeah, two and a bit years of learning to kind of get to that point.
High sex drive, nymphomania, sex addiction. Can you help me untangle these three?
Yeah, absolutely, completely different. Saying that porn addiction or sex addiction is having a high sex drive is like saying that somebody who is clinically obese is hungrier than everybody else. Yeah, we all have different appetites at different levels. Some people are hornier than others. That's nature. But when it's to the point where actually it's causing significant harm in other areas of your life, but in spite of that you can't stop, then it's definitely an issue. And I guess what tends to happen if you're someone who chronically overeats, or indeed actually if you're just a human being, we all know we eat when we're not hungry. Yeah, appetite is not the same thing. We eat because it looks nice, it's tasty, it's satisfying, and exactly the same process happens with sex. And I think in many respects, talking about sex and porn addiction it has more similarities with chronic overeating than it does with other types of addiction, because there is an element, of course, of the survival mechanism being part of it, and it is in part to do with appetite. But it's when your appetite has gone that rife, it's really got nothing to do with hunger. It's got nothing to do with sex drive. It's all to do with arousal in the brain, not arousal in the genitals. That's the bit that's really being stimulated.
And Jack, in your experience?
I would say that I agree with Paula that they're so unrelated that I actually have very little expertise in this area. So, I think that especially with the kind of guys that I help, their porn use is more. It becomes a strong habit or a compulsion, mainly due to a combination of opportunity and a sort of opportunity, habit, and dysfunctional coping mechanisms for negative emotional states, combined with that level of opportunity. And then also combined with how it taps into deep fundamental evolutionary drives in the same way that, as Paula says, food addiction and eating disorders can do. So I think that they're pretty unrelated. I think a very high sex drive will make you more susceptible to probably developing a compulsive porn usage pattern, but there's not really much of an overlap, I don't think.
I think in my experience, so many people who've developed porn addiction have actually got no idea what their sex drive is anymore. In the same way as somebody who's very overweight doesn't know what it feels like to be hungry because they eat before they ever get the chance to get hungry. So one of the sort of pieces of work that you do is actually about helping people get back in touch with what is their innate sex drive and reclaim their sexuality from that.
Is it common to see sex and porn addiction exist simultaneously?
Fine line. I mean, as Jack will know and millions of other people, once you're on the porn sites, most pornography is just clickbait. Yeah, most of it's free. Vast majority of it's free. And the objective is to get people to the paid for material. The marketing in porn is absolutely phenomenal. And so it's getting you to the webcam sites. So if you're watching webcam, is that porn or is that sex? If you're on chat sites, if you start going to adult hookup sites, if you start looking at kind of sex worker sites, if you're on OnlyFans, if you're on, are we talking about porn here, or are we talking about sex? Pornography is a form of sexuality. It's a compulsive sexual behaviour. Pornography is one aspect of compulsive sexual behaviour, and there are many others. But in my experience, pornography often is a bit like the gateway drug. It's kind of where you start, and then, of course, those clever little spider things or whatever they are in the background drag you to the paid for stuff. Jack will understand that side of it a heck of a lot better than I do.
How did COVID affect the rise in these addictions?
I don't think it had much of an effect, certainly for us as a company. I think that, especially with our target demographic. So me and Paula kind of serve slightly different audiences as our primary audience, I believe. So, our audience is typically, we offer a sort of somewhat of a self-serve solution for the sort of 16 to 35-year-old guys primarily, whereas Paula offers a much more comprehensive service for, with much more engagement, and for maybe people that are willing to also invest more in their recovery.
Well, I think that with the Laurel
potentially.
Centre, but not with Pivotal Recovery. But I'm sure we'll come on to that. But yeah, we've got something else now. Yeah.
Okay. So within our target audience of these like 16 to 35-year-old guys, let's say some studies show that maybe like 40% of that demographic are watching porn on a daily basis anyway, like from, and that's studies taken from, like, those are like pre-COVID studies. And then you're looking at like some difficult to measure, but very high percentage of guys that are watching porn like once, twice, 3 times a week or more anyway. So, I don't think COVID sort of made a significant change to those numbers. It might have given us a small tailwind, but I don't think it made much difference personally.
So I think we saw something slightly different. And according to the research, porn viewing rocketed in COVID. And I think that is because of the opportunity and the availability, the working from home, not being able to socialise, go out, have usual access to your coping strategies. But the research has gone on to show that although the figures actually rose significantly, in terms of those that then describe themselves as being addicted as a consequence, the majority have come back down. And many of us experienced that with alcohol. An awful lot of people drank more during lockdown, they ate more during lockdown. But then, actually, as life has settled back to normal, behaviours go back to normal as well. So the vast majority, even though pornography use went up, didn't become addicted. But at the Laurel Centre, we actually found we had a waiting list for the first time ever in the first lockdown. And we went from, at the beginning of COVID, I had 14 therapists working for me. By the end, I had 24. So we'd almost doubled in
Oh, wow.
size to actually cope with the number of new inquiries. But to be honest, I suspect that is not so much because of an increased number of people struggling, but actually increased access to services. Because so many people were actually then saying, you know what, let's do therapy online. We're doing this online. We're doing, it's brilliant. And so many more people were actually accepting of those services. And for Pivotal, it has been very much the right time to be launching a new online service, because I think it is precisely where the market is going. It's what we need to be doing.
So, Jack, you mentioned that your target market is predominantly male, that your user base is predominantly male, but gender politics seems to have quite an important effect on this already misunderstood issue. Okay, I'm sure he'll be back. But Dr. Hall, in your
I could talk
experience,
about that. I
to what
think, yeah.
extent does it exacerbate the problem?
Oh gosh, you are so on something there. I mean, I think Remojo is brilliant. I really do think it's a fantastic platform, and it's offering something. It's really filled a gap. But it is very male centric, and unapologetically so. It is male centric. It is aimed at men, but unfortunately, it just continues the message that pornography is a male problem. Women are the victim of it, and in some ways that is true. But I would say just look at the statistics of what Jack is representing here. Men are the victim of pornography as well, but women struggle with sex and porn addiction as well, hugely. And very much one of the things that we wanted to be sure about with Pivotal was that actually it was very gender neutral. And I think we've always assumed that porn was for guys, porn was bad for guys, porn was a male problem. But actually, hello, 50% at least of the population are female. Where are our voices in that? And I think it's really important that we get involved in that discourse again, because it is not just the guys that are affected by porn, it's very much women as well, both as kind of consumers and struggling with the usage, but then also obviously some of the messages that go along with it. Don't worry, Jack, I answered for you. You're fine.
Jack, we were talking about the fact that Remojo has a predominant male base.
Yeah.
What about the assisting of, recovery from porn addiction for women? What have you found in terms of female base? Are they just less inclined to join or admit that it's a problem?
So I think it's a somewhat complex question. I've got a few different answers to this, actually. I can answer this in a few different ways. So, I mean, for one thing is where we are a startup company. So, this is BizNews. And from a business perspective, when you start a startup, you have to, have a very, very specific niche that you make a very specific offer to. And then over time, as your company grows, you can introduce additional offers and serve additional market segments. Now, I think that the motivation for signing up to our service differs slightly between, say, men and women. So I think a lot of the young guys that sign up for us, they're not necessarily addicted. They just want to quit pornography for whatever reason. And so they see it as step one in the journey to becoming the kind of man that they envision and that they want to be. And so there's a huge, like, sort of young masculine personal growth kind of drive to that action. And so our brand and our like follow-on programs and courses and related discussion is all built around that and being part of that journey, right? Whereas a more therapeutic mental health, almost medical approach would be possibly more gender neutral. And so from a company perspective, that's how we've approached it. Another thing is just from a pragmatic perspective is that when I first started the company, we were, our branding and marketing presentation of our product was totally gender neutral. And to be honest, not a single woman responded to any of my messages. In the early days, I had hundreds of our users with my personal WhatsApp number. Not a single one of them was a woman. So out of 200 users, all 200 of them were men. And so while women can theoretically sign up and use Remojo, we've just found that in general they don't. And also quite a lot of um, media, like journalists, if they are women, they tend to be highly intrigued by the problem, but not really connect or empathize with it that much. And so, that's been my experience so far, just in terms of like building up the company and talking to users, interacting with users, and also interacting with the mainstream public on this topic.
So you said that your first experience with pornographic content was at the age of 10. That's frighteningly young. I mean, one can
Yes.
imagine how affronting that is to a child's psyche.
Yeah.
In what ways and to what extent, and this is interesting because you would both have very different places from which to answer this question, but is the widespread availability of porn affecting a healthy viewpoint in children and adolescents about sexual interaction?
If it's the only education you have is pornography, then you're going to grow up with a very warped idea of what sex is. But in the same way, if the only way you ever learn about driving a car is from playing Grand Theft Auto, you're going to be a pretty rubbish driver, yeah, and a dangerous one at that. And so we need to make sure feel really passionately about good sex and relationship education, and that it's got to include pornography. And one of the reasons that Pivotal Recovery was set up as a not-for-profit organisation was so that we will be able to fund more research and fund more education to young people about pornography. Because I think that's the only way we're really going to get over this problem, because it's always going to be there and it's always going to be accessible, and children will always be intrigued. Always. It's that is fairly natural and instinctive. We've got to get the education out there.
Jack, in your experience?
I think just from a almost like common sense perspective, how can it not, right? Like everything that we interact with shapes our brains and our perceptions. So why wouldn't exposing yourself to extreme sexual content on a very regular basis shape the way that you perceive what that thing is? Of course it will. Like whatever we engage with and whatever we feed our minds with shapes our perception and the way that we interact the world. So I feel like your engagement with pornography is training your brain to think in certain ways, react to certain things, enjoy certain things, and perceive certain things as normal. And certainly I know from first-hand experience and then also second-hand experience through all of our users, your perception of sex does change. The way your sex life and the way you show up in your sex life does change, and the way that you perceive women or partners or significant others or whatever does change as well. You appreciate them more holistically, and you realize that you have been led astray, and your perceptions and expectations have been shaped, and you'll find that out when you leave it and cut it out from your life, basically through subjective experience.
Are there common causal factors in people with the tendency to develop these addictions? Perhaps specific markers or red flags that people can look out for, even when they sort of assess their own habits as either healthy or having crossed over to unhealthy sexual activity?
There's been quite a lot of research on this, and I think risk factors is the way to to kind of term it. If you've got a family member that's had a significant addiction, then we know that you are biologically more predisposed to developing an addiction yourself. So if addiction runs in
And
your
this is any
family,
addiction?
any addiction, indeed, any addiction. If
Okay.
you've had another type of addiction in the past, I mean, unfortunately, pornography is a very effective way of getting sober from alcohol and drugs. Not a good way, obviously, but it's actually quite an effective way of doing it. And we see an awful lot of people coming for help who are in recovery from chemical addiction, but then become addicted to this. So previous addiction of yourself would be a risk factor as well. If you've had significant trauma in your life, significant childhood issues, if you struggle to trust other people, if you struggle to trust people to comfort you, you're more likely to turn to things for comfort than people. And early exposure, we do know, is also linked with developing addictions, and that research has happened certainly in chemical addiction. And we're beginning to see the results of that following on into pornography addiction as well. So early exposure is a risk factor. But I think there's kind of two things in this, Nadia. There's looking at the factors that might be causes, and obviously they're important, but none of us have a time machine to be able to go back and fix those. But in many respects, what's most important for people is recognizing what the maintaining factors are. I know I've got a problem. I know this is causing issues in my life. I want to stop. I've tried to stop, but I keep failing to stop. So what is it that's going on that is stopping the change from happening that you really want? And I think that's the bit that matters more importantly than perhaps the issues that led you to it in the first place. Often they're intertwined, though, which gets complicated. But yeah, what's maintaining it?
Mm. And Jack, have you found any common threads between your user base?
Yeah, I think that so the way something that I focus on in terms of, or how I see kind of the development of dysfunctional behaviors and compulsions and addictions is they're essentially dysfunctional coping mechanisms for negative emotions, and basically whatever comes along will, if you're in an emotionally vulnerable state, whatever comes along that provides that comfort and that dopamine fix and that hook will be the thing of choice. So for example, if you have a terrible negative event, let's say like someone commits suicide, that a friend, family member, whatever, you're dealing with extreme grief, someone offers you cigarette and you start smoking, you might become hooked on smoking. Someone offers you a drink, you start drinking, and you maybe develop a drinking problem. You start surfing around looking for porn, you might develop a compulsive or porn usage pattern. It's when you're kind of, it's when you're emotionally vulnerable and that thing provides the fix for that temporarily, that it has the potential to hook people. And so I think basically people that are in frequent or high states of emotional vulnerability are susceptible to this, because young men, let's say, if they feel isolated, if they feel a strong level, like a high level of anxiety, depression, maybe they feel rejected by peers, or women, for example, they feel like they're unattractive, they have low self-esteem, then because porn's actually more available even than like drink or cigarettes or whatever. It's always there. It's right in your pocket, like right now at any time. So it's always there as a fix for negative emotions for young men. And so I think just people with like some aspect of negative some negative aspect of mental health are just more susceptible to developing a compulsive
I think if I can
usage
pick
of
you up on a
porn.
couple of things on that, though, Jack. I mean, the first thing is I really try to avoid talking about negative emotions. Emotions are emotions. We feel there's nothing, grief may be uncomfortable, but it's a very natural emotion. We can't avoid negative emotions, not unless
Well,
we end our
I
lives.
mean,
So
when I say negative,
some,
can I clarify then? Because when I say
yeah.
negative, I mean an emotion that people want to escape.
Yeah, but I think often we can't escape those emotions. We have to learn to manage them in a different way because we can't escape. And I think getting away from the idea of negative emotions and positive emotions, and just actually some are more comfortable than others is more helpful. But the other thing that we know from research, and this is going back to your question about what happened during COVID, a lot of us felt very uncomfortable in COVID. We felt isolated, we felt frightened, we were fearful for our health, we were fearful for our jobs, we were fearful for our loved ones. All of our usual coping mechanisms, completely agree with Jack that it's used as a coping mechanism. Most of our coping mechanisms were taken away, and that's why porn use increased, and drinking and overeating. They all increased during that period. But then as life got back to normal again, the vast majority of people changed those habits. So it's not simply, so whilst a strong, uncomfortable emotion might trigger a habit, actually, what is it that maintains it? Because actually, the vast majority of people stop. So one of the things you might be aware of, back in the Vietnam War, a huge percentage of the American troops that were sent over to Vietnam started taking heroin to survive. The trauma in Vietnam was absolutely horrendous, and something ridiculous like 80% of US troops started using heroin. So they expected when they came back home that this was going to be a chronic problem, because heroin is one of the most addictive substances known to man. But actually, what happened when they got back to their normal lives, to their loved ones, to their usual environment, it was something like only about 15% maintained the addiction. The others, as soon as you took them out of that stressful environment, changed. So when the stress is over, if the behavior is continuing, then it is much more than just behavior change. And I think that this is where the big difference is really between pivotal recovery and Remojo, is that pivotal is really about changing your life rather than changing your habits. Because I think for many people, habit change certainly works for a lot of people, but for others it doesn't, and that's when you need to really start looking at the ways in which you need to change your life, not just your behaviors.
Jack, do you have anything more to add on that topic?
I actually agree, which is why Paula's probably not aware of this, but we actually have a program that helps people build a more fulfilling life around the pornography as well. So, I agree with the approach. So basically, what we start off with Remojo is people need to drive a wedge between themselves and the pornography to create a bit of space to start to get momentum in their lives, feel better about themselves, improve their self-esteem, and then start taking more action that builds a more fulfilling life, reducing the emotional vulnerability to addiction and compulsion, and so on. So, yeah, I agree with that. I think that the abstinence, the cutting, the blocking, and so on. People want control. They're desperate for some control at the beginning, and we start there because that's the pain point people have, and that's what people want. They want that control, but then we have to take people on a journey and say that you're not going to get out of this until you fulfill your emotional needs and you have real social bonds and real relationships and better physical and mental health around that. So, yeah.
Is there a particular age or age group during which addictions to sex and porn are likely to manifest?
Between the ages of 9 and 12.
Really that early?
Well, that's when the susceptibility is greatest. So if you look at what happens in the brain, the sexual templates generally start beginning to come online between the ages of somewhere between 9 and 12, 9 and 14, varies in different cultures and different developmental stages. So if you've experienced a trauma or a crisis in your life between those ages, and that might be early exposure to pornography, as Jack described in his story, then you are more likely to develop sex and porn addiction than another kind of addiction. And there has been quite a lot of research that's been done on that. And certainly with the people that I work with, some kind of significant event during that period of time when the sexual templates are forming is incredibly common, incredibly common. And I think we're all vulnerable during those early adolescent years. In any case, it's a pretty horrible, tough time.
Just to close off with, and this relates back to the paramount importance of education, because in these times, firewalls will be breached. Life is online. We can't deprive children of online learning, for example, just to try and protect them from these things. So, how would you suggest educating children once they have questions about sex and porn in a way that encourages healthy understanding of sex, but also doesn't overactivate their curiosity?
I think you're asking a question which is such an age-old question about, and this course varies in different countries. But one of the things that I was really pleased about in the UK, a white paper came out in, I think it was 2012, when sex and relationship education was made compulsory within schools, and I was very pleased to be quite instrumental in ensuring that pornography was part of the curriculum. So that's going right back to the education that happens in schools. And there's been quite a lot of research on where young people want to get their education from. And a lot of them don't want it from their parents. They don't want mum and dad talking about
No.
sex. Please, heaven help me. They just don't want that. So actually, within schools, within community groups, within wherever kids are hanging around, those are the kinds of areas where this education needs to happen, where it's amongst their peers as well. But I think you're right. There needs to be access to this kind of information online as well. And I think it's one of the challenges of blockers. And I know Jack's product is by far one of the most sophisticated there is in the market today. And it's certainly the one that I recommend to my clients. But one of the challenges with blockers is potentially you're blocking some of the clumsier ones are blocking access to important education and information that young people need around this topic. So it's a really challenging one, but we need to educate the educators to talk about this stuff in a healthy way. And there are more and more people doing it, which is good. We're getting there.
And just before we move on to you, Jack, do you just have a brief outline of what pornography criteria looks like in porn education?
Yeah, I think it starts with talking about, what is pornography? When is it something that's healthy? When is it that something that's negative? Why do people watch it? Why do people get into it? And I think it's the very much the first step is helping young people to talk about it. But I think we want to be a generation that isn't shaming young people, that is still very comfortable talking about where babies come from and all that kind of stuff, and being very open to and being much more open to sexual diversity, because that is so important in our education as well. So I think it's just making sex a lot less taboo. And pornography, pictures of it is just one part of what it is to be sexual. And of course, we do have to remember that porn is not damaging for everybody in the same way as alcohol and sugar is not damaging for everybody. And it's about, how do you know when it is a problem? How do you know when something is upsetting, when something doesn't make you happy, when it's life enhancing or life draining? And I think helping young people to develop that emotional resilience within themselves, emotional awareness and emotional resilience, so they have more choice. I think that's what we're really teaching young people, is about choice.
And Jack, let's close off with you.
Yeah, so I mean, the first thing is to say that, so at Remojo we focus on adult men that have basically have woken up to the fact that they have a problem. So we're not really looking at kids and under 16s, under 17s, because I think that's a very different problem. So I think that they are generally too young to really, I think, be able to understand or even be able to handle. I don't think a sort of 13-year-old or 12-year-old or whatever is mentally equipped to actually handle pornography in any way. So, and also I think it's so compelling that they don't even want to quit, right? They want to watch as much as possible. It's very, so that's not our target audience in terms of our product. I think to talk to the societal aspects of things, though, to be honest, I think I think the approach of Western democracies is a disgrace on this issue. And I think that the fact that we're setting the bar so low that we're just like, oh, we can't stop them. We can't stop them accessing. Well, maybe we can't stop 100% of kids accessing pornography. But I think if there was a real serious effort to control and enforce, develop a sophisticated system of age verification, big penalties for producers and publishers for giving kids access, and other kinds of, initiatives. I refuse to believe that this is an impossible task to at least protect 80-90% of kids from pornography. Yeah, some people are going to find it, some people are going to download Tor browser and get into all kinds of disgusting niches of all kinds of content, extreme violence. We do manage to protect children from, in large part from extreme gore and violence. So I don't see why we couldn't do the same with pornography. And so I think as a society, we're setting the bar way too low. Yes, it's impossible to get to 100%, but we should be aiming for 80-90%, I think, and really making much, much more sophisticated efforts because kids are not equipped to deal with it. And as Paula said, they don't want to talk to their parents about it. So, I think we need to look out for kids and buy them a bit of time, buy as many of them as we can a bit of time so they're confronted with pornography when they're 16, when maybe they've actually had some sexual interactions, maybe they actually have a romantic life or a sex life that's starting to emerge. And then it complements their existing understanding of that and it can be integrated. But I think that we've got to do more to protect people when they're vulnerable and they can't look out for themselves. So that's what I think about that.
Fascinating and really important discussion, Jack Jenkins. Dr. Paula Hall, thank you again so much for your time. I'm
Thank you.
Nadja Swart for BizNews.com.
Thank you.